Um, so who here is willing to accept our new AI overlords? Who's ready? Me too. Of course, you could say that AI is just one of many things that's already something that something else can do better than humans. Of course, calculators, computers, and I think what's so interesting about this is just the general nature of how good it is across different topics. So Aidan and I will be talking through a couple of examples of how AI can do significantly better jobs focused in on the data governance space. So the reason why CLUEDIN and Microsoft are talking together is because CLUEDIN is a strategic partner with Microsoft. You may know Microsoft Purview, it's the data governance solution from Microsoft, and CLUEDIN helps with the MDM and data quality parts of that to kind of tick all of those critical capabilities you would want from a data governance platform. There's a couple of interesting keywords on this. We're talking about, I guess, the core pillars of what makes CLUEDIN interesting, things like automation. And I guess the big difference here with the large language models is this is more about an augmentation. It's not about doing things without your approval or without involving a human, and that's really what this discussion is about as well. So we kind of have this joint philosophy here at CLUEDIN and Microsoft that we think it's really important to bring the non-technical people into the supply chain of data. And I think if you look at all the technical stacks that we're putting together, they're pretty much buried in IT and engineering. And for very good reason. And everybody has now been gifted, wrapped up in this nice ubiquitous bow, a new programming language in the form of the natural language of large language models. Sometimes it's, I guess, hard to foresee the importance of those non-technical but the domain experts. What's the importance of them playing an actual role in the supply chain of data instead of just being a consumer of the data that comes out the end? And I always use an example of our VP of Finance, Jonathan. Jonathan's one of these guys that is just so good at his job. He's so good at tax. He's so good at accounting. For example, he's put all of our accounts offshore into a place called Panama. We haven't played tax in a long time. Where's Raul? That was the joke. Not good? Right. So at the same vein, still, I guess, encapsulating all the requirements you would need from and ask for an MDM solution, like matching and merging, linking, deduplication, audit trails, cleaning of data, standardization, but empowering those individuals with the large language models. So Aidan's going to help me take us through a couple of practical examples of how our joint customers are actually using this different functionality. I'm going to take you through, in order of return of investment, the top 10 countdown of the ways that it is penetrating into the data governance space. And I'm going to skip between different elements of data governance. Sometimes it'll be privacy, compliance. Sometimes it'll be master data. Sometimes it'll be data quality. Through our partnership, we were lucky enough to have early access to Azure OpenAI. And this allowed us to kind of at least have a little bit of upfront experience before the market knew too much about it into what would be the big overall positives of this for our joint customers, but also what were the guardrails that we would need to put in place to actually make this run in production use cases. It's not hard to envisage that people are using this on the edge of the business through co-pilots and ChatGPT, Bard, etc. But how does this actually make its way into data pipelines? And that required a lot of work around putting in workflow processes, finding ways to predictably short-circuit the large language model when it didn't return a good answer, and that was a lot trickier to make that predictable than maybe you might think. It's always important that vendors like us that integrate with the bedrock that has been provided from Microsoft, that we give something back in the integration. And although, let's be honest, the large language models are doing most of the lifting in this integration, it's our ability to feed that in and integrate it into the actual functionality that you would get within a data governance platform. Its ability to build rules, its ability to set up data policies, its ability to set up data quality rules, and now it can be aided through the use of Copilot as well. One of the interesting findings from our joint work with Microsoft was as you start to cut through the technology stack, you do start to realize that there's an overall net positive that large language models really influence every single part of the stack. And so IT, of course, will be using this, engineering will be using this, but really I think where the biggest chasm that's being jumped is that these non-technical domain experts that don't know Python, that don't know how to code, are suddenly kind of given those capabilities without need to actually learn and build languages themselves. The way that ADON and I and Microsoft and CLUEDIN in general think about data governance is from an offensive and a defensive perspective. And it's probably no surprise that you can't do one without the other. And if you're wanting to run on the offensive parts of using AI, you're going to always be slowed down at the last steps if you haven't got some of those fundamentals around privacy and compliance. So let's start with the first countdown, number 10. And actually, this is one of the examples that ADON has a pretty pertinent customer example to talk through. So let's start. One of the big parts of compliance and privacy is that obviously we've got all of these silos of data where we've already let PHI, PII, PCI DSS compliant issues out. And it's because we haven't captured that data necessarily at entry. And it just so happens that the kind of pattern matching techniques that we use today, like regular expressions, can't pick up on the nuance of data that doesn't exactly fit those patterns. Things like accidentally putting an extra hyphen in a credit card or accidentally putting a space in the last characters of an IBAN number. We're not really, as engineers, writing our patterns to detect those types of things, and hence the large language models are here to help fill that void. A good example I always like to use is salary data. Here's two sentences, one is private and one is not. John Smith thinks salaries over $100,000 are too low. Then John Smith's salary is $100,000. Notice the same tokens, but the nuance and context, one's personally identifying and one is not. Large language models are extremely good at picking up on that nuance. And this will never be a solved problem. We're just lowering the amount of risk and capturing more of these edge cases. So ADON, why don't you talk us through an example?
Tim. So the way I kind of want to break this down is two parts. There's the obvious things like job title addresses that will be subject to things like GDPR, personally identifiable information. But that doesn't include things that are more specific to your organization. That might be IP, it might be top secret projects, documents that have a lot of classified information, schematics, blueprints as an example, even code that's quite difficult for traditional regexes to pick up because they're pattern-based identifiers. There's not easy patterns in things like IP when it comes down to that. So the great thing about AI is giving you the ability to upload your own content that's specific to your organization and build a model from that in a way to detect it because it's not pattern-based. And then we can start thinking about governing controls. So my role at Microsoft is security and compliance technical specialist. Bit of a mouthful, but in practical terms, that means I care about how data is governed in the cloud. So when I'm looking at things like detecting if there's a document that has salary data and that leaving an email gateway as an example, how do I detect that using tools when there's no patterns in there? So this is where your own models can come in, upload that into the cloud, build a model from that, and then you've got extra controls like privacy, retention, user access, and stuff like that. So typically most of the organizations that I speak to are concerned about the obvious things like credit card numbers, which, standard PCI regulation will dictate that. But when we're looking at things going beyond that, so salary information, HR contracts, it could be CVs, the only consistency around that is the format of the document and the information that you would see in there. So a regular expression is going to find that really hard to determine. So what you can now do is look at all of this sensitive information using a model that you've built, trust its accuracy, and if you don't feel like it's picking up the information you need, upload more of that seed content, refine that model, and train it to get to where you're looking for. And that really goes back down to things like data quality, as an example. You don't want to lean into automation until you know you can actually trust the data sets that you've got sitting in the cloud.
Excellent. So number 9, let's go on the slightly defensive side again. So think about the governance projects that we're all running. Often they're very top-down driven, where a governance department will hand down these rules and policies and standards, and often they're all based off international standards of some sorts. However, the actual tricky part is in enforcing the actual models and standards. A good example would be, it's easy enough to say that we want a phone number in an RFC 3966 standard, but as an engineer, if you've experienced cleaning that kind of data, you've got a complexity on all the possible ways people can write that data on the way in, and then being able to transform that on the way out. It is close to uncanny how close a policy that you would register in a data governance platform is to the actual policy, is to the actual prompt that you would write to a large language model to do the actual transformation itself. And so there's a huge return on investment here, just because the knowledge gap, the requirement for us to know what all of these policies actually do, you can imagine the acceleration we would get by not having to be necessarily experts on that. Any stories from yourself?
Yeah, another great example. So going back to the data quality example, it's quite difficult for your end users to police and govern the way your information is inputted into the cloud, right? You want to be able to trust that. So removing that burden to your end users and allow machine learning to actually go ahead and apply that format means end users can punch in that data, not worry about whether it's correct or wrong, and you don't have to worry about another human down the line looking at and reviewing those data sets to trust that they're okay.
It's always the humans, isn't it?
It's always the humans. We make mistakes, and I think the main focus here is how can we offload some of the mundane tasks that we have around security and governance to surfaces, so end users can crack on with what they need to day to day.
Yep, makes sense. So this one is actually, I can't understate how much this is going to accelerate this big problem that probably we're always, as businesses, trying to crack, is breaking down the silos. And there's so many discussions I've been part of with a big company where they say, well, we have 400 applications. And the honest truth is, it's just, that guy laughed on my behalf. I was going to say laughable, but he did it before me. The large language models, there's, of course, whenever you're trying to bring data together, there's this entire mapping process where you need to trade semantics. And the history of this technically was starting off with this concept of word vectors. Instead of being able to detect things like, last name and surname, they have a string distance, but the semantic difference is extremely close to each other, if not identical. And that was the concept of word vectors that then evolved into word embeddings, which then evolved into large language models. There are all of these types of well-known systems that run the entire world, mostly things like supply chain. SAP is a good example, but something like Salesforce, let's take that. They come out of the box with accounts, leads, deals, contacts. They've already well-defined and structured these domains. But that doesn't mean that fits nicely into the rest of the world. You then throw in a system like SAP where all the tables are in German and in acronyms, you start to realize that becomes a really hard process to map semantics between these systems. And these large language models chew this up. They have obviously crawled SAP mapping tables. They have obviously crawled websites that have done this manual translation for you, and they are built into the generic models, even the really earlier ones like DaVinci. They are completely aware and understand things like SAP and Oracle tables. Anything to add there?
Yeah, I don't know if there's anyone that started a career in tech support like I did, but one of the biggest pain points I had was troubleshooting and looking at someone else's documentation and notes on how to fix an issue. And what you're missing there is the fact that everyone kind of writes notes and information in their own way, right? It's quite unique. So when you're searching for information, you almost have to think about the person that's wrote the article and document to find what you're looking for.
Right.
instead of quickly finding the answer to what you're looking for. And especially in support, where you've got customers that are angry because something's broken and you want to fix that quickly. Thinking about things like SLAs, you want to get answers quite quick. So when we're looking at semantics, you can start connecting dots through things like acronyms and synonyms and different words and phrases that the team might use, but have a relationship to each other and frankly mean the same thing. So instead of me going in and trying to find a number of different ways that Tim may have written down an article and the way I could fix something that's technically broken, I could just punch in and use my own natural language again and bring that back on the relationship to the words and phrases Tim has used, get an answer out to the customer, and then I'm good to go. So that's just kind of a small example of bringing that into real world terms, but the relationships between data is often missed because, again, back to users, we don't often take the time to tag and categorize information in a way that's effective for other people to use that content because we're trying to do other stuff. So you allow the machines to take care of it, and then you've got extra free time.
Yeah, and very much it's an augmented experience. It can't it gets things wrong. But that's exactly the way I think these AIs are sold as well, is that it's a co-pilot. It is not an autopilot. And that's the way they should be treated, and that's also why it's relatively hard to start to bring these into real-life operational pipelines. And the truth, at least from our exposure, has been you will have to set the expectations of some level of risk you're willing to take on when you're dealing with something heuristic instead of deterministic. So number 7. This is kind of, I guess, the bread and butter of not only data quality, but MDM specifically, is there's so many different ways to refer to this, but it's basically getting rid of duplicates. And the thing that's so amazing about the introduction and the augmentation of the large language models is just how well they're able to explain the reasoning behind why it thought records were duplicates. And often when you are going through the practice of getting rid of duplicate records, you set up these rules, it then provides a set of clusters, and you go and try to pick which one is the right one. And often in that case, the part that's tricky is that you need more reference, because you might have things like an industry code show up, and you're like, what is that? I know it's not the same, but if I was to translate the industry code, maybe that will help me make a better decision on these bringing these duplicates together. So I think the biggest thing here would be that's being cracked is the ability to explain the reasoning instead of showing things like a dependency weights tree because deduplication gets really heavy. So there's been a big transparency and opaqueness that has come in from this as well. Number 6, and I know you've got a couple of things to mention on this as well, Aidan. I mentioned at the start the top-down governance approach, in that although it's still important to have, handing down terminology, handing down data dictionaries might be very important to the data governance team, but is often met with this, I'm going to say maybe a falsity that it's because we have a bad data culture that people aren't actually adopting these dictionaries. I put it down to something else, that everyone has their own metrics and KPIs and everyone is busy, and being given and handed down these Bibles to be able to use in terminology, that's where this friction in Aidan's example before comes. You're not speaking my language, I speak another vocabulary, we've got to meet somewhere. And the ability for custom models to embed your glossaries and your data dictionaries so they are organically inbuilt into the way you consume through the co-pilots, that will be cracked. To some degree, it's already cracked. The ability to say, give me my customers, and it says, we don't call them customers, we call them clients, because a customer would indicate that the transaction is now done, and a client is that there is an ongoing relationship. That organic translation can be done with that semantics that we're trading with the large language models as well. Anything you want to add, Aidan?
The give me customers is a great example. So I'm thinking in terms of being a new starter at a new organization, you haven't had the time or the experience to really understand all the different acronyms that your organization uses across that, but you're trying to find documents, data, reports, and dashboards, and you're using simple terms like customers.
Right.
This is where you can leverage large language models to come in and provide that prompt and training to say, looks like you were looking for customers,
Yes.
but we're looking for clients. And I think that gives people time back, because not everyone has the time to ping someone and say, I'm looking for this document. We're in calls, we might be back to back, but you need something urgently. And the person that has the knowledge you're looking for, and it's a really simple misunderstanding, the person that has that knowledge is tied up and it's setting you back. So if you're thinking about deliverables, you have a rough idea of the report or the dashboard that you need, have the prompts take care of that, surface what you need, and you're spending less time looking for stuff and more time actually sending and amending those documents and getting that time back.
Yeah, it's really bridging that top-down approach versus bottom-up. I really see it as a way that meeting somewhere in the middle. We still want people to take on that vocabulary, and they might not, they might not get it the first time, but if they keep asking for customers and you keep reminding them, this is the definition of a client, it's in our glossary, this is where it came from, but I'll give you the data you asked for, I believe there's a stronger chance that that will be adopted. Number 5. Back on the defensive side, when GDPR hit, CLUEDIN is a Danish business, so of course that was very important for us to crack that. I would argue I didn't want to be a GDPR expert, and then CCPA hit, and I'm like, I definitely don't want to be a CCPA expert, but I have nothing against being compliant. And with Microsoft's purview, they moved earlier in the year to also include their compliance and their trust center pieces, which is all about the ISO certifications and the HIPAA compliance and things like this, where they've actually detailed what does it require to actually be ISO 27K certified. And you can imagine combining this now with the data that sits within unstructured and within maybe your data lake or something like this, requires us less and less to be experts in this field, and can enforce a lot more augmentation and automatic scanning to start applying this mass amount of compliance checks across the data that you're working with. Anything?
Yeah, I'll be brief because I know we're coming up to time.
Sure.
I think the unstructured data presents a particular challenge just because of the nature of what it is. There's less governance and control around that. So we're looking at things like documents, emails, communications, right? We're creating, sharing, sending stuff all the time. I'm sure some of us have desktops that are full of documents that are 2-3 years old. You know, that might contain PII data. You needed it for a job or project. You put it on your desktop because it's easy to access, you know it's there, but it contains data that relates to GDPR. And you've not thought about that, you were just thinking about you're thinking about the deliverables themselves. So this is where we can start putting more context into unstructured data and understanding there's sensitive data in that. And as a compliance control that's proactive, a level of automation that we can get is a retention policy that says, okay, It's got PII, we need to bin that off in a year, and then your end users don't need to care about it anymore, and the business is no longer at risk as well.
Yeah, 100%. So with the final ones, number 4, Aidan's already touched on this, but when working with data, to some degree, a lot of us are comfortable with structured data, and there's so many tools available to help with that. And the big gap has always been, what about the rest of the stuff? And to be honest, I think it's always been a little bit of like we'll probably get to that, it's possible, but it's never practical for us to solve some of the unstructured pieces. Naturally, one of the big pieces, specifically with compliance, is what about these soft references? What about the mention of a name, but of course, on a very common name, which person are you actually referring to? This was done traditionally with something called named entity recognition as part of that NLP movement, but once again, the large language models understand more nuance about the topics that are being talked and can really be used to turn those soft references into harder references. Number 3, and this is, I guess, an overall theme of the way that Microsoft and CLUEDIN think about data governance in general, is bringing the non-technical people into the supply chain of data. Not as consumers, that's great, but as actually producers as well. I gave the example of our VP of Finance. He is the person that should be checking the data quality and enriching and making those domains more valuable, not IT. And the large language models have now given those non-technical users the ability to be slightly technical, because it still does require parts of data analysis, etc. Number two, and this is such an odd one, because I would say it's such a deterministic thing, or that's what I thought. Impact analysis of change. So as natural entropy happens in a business, underlying and upstream systems change structures, change models, change the way that they talk to each other, being able to adapt to this change is often something completely halts pipelines. Coming back to that augmented mapping experience where it can help you trade the semantics of it was called surname before and now it's called last name, that's something that would usually stop a pipeline, and now you can imagine how suggestions can be made to get you back on that those clean data pipelines when change inevitably happens. And I think the number one is probably no surprise, because there's a huge, there's a massive ROI. But if someone was to ask me how close are we to this, I would say we are very far off, which is probably pretty odd and contrarian to say in a space moving as fast as this, where it seems like every day you wake up and there is a new evolution. But I still come back to my firm belief that the ability for companies to build their own custom models, due to some of the ideas that ADON mentioned around the privacy and the data quality pieces, we're still very far off that coming to reality. And naturally, I guess the holy grail is to take your business's knowledge in SharePoint and OneDrive and Salesforce and Dynamics and somehow instill that into your own custom model. The unfortunate thing is, if I send 15 records that are all the same person but have different data, what is that experience going to be like for the co-pilot? But this, without a doubt, when we talk to our joint customers, is the direction that everybody's wanting to go in. So we are on time. We are finished. Thank you so much.
That's it.
Thank you, man.
Good to be your host.